Welcome back. In this lecture, I'll give an overview for the Enlightenment. As I mentioned earlier in our class, fiction appears as a popular art form when the technology exists to produce inexpensive, mass-produced printed material, such as books and magazines. Magazines during the mid-1800s were so popular that the period is sometimes called the Age of Magazines. Steam-powered presses are developed for print shops in the early 1800s. Before this, fiction existed, with a few books published here and there. Some of the books were written by printers, so essentially, they published their own books, and some wealthy authors paid for the publication of their own books. But the exploration of fiction doesn't take place until mechanical presses are able to drastically lower labor costs of printed material. At this point, in the early 1800s in America and elsewhere, writers begin to focus and explore the possibilities of this new art form. Fiction, at its essence, is a way to present a story, which was far more associated in earlier times with dramatic stage presentations, in a way that could be communicated on the page. It is essentially drama plus writing. Readers could have enjoyed these early books at home, alone, but often these early works of fiction were read aloud, perhaps in a public space, so many could enjoy the book at the same time. There were two reasons for this. First, books were extremely scarce, so a town might only have one copy of a particular title. And second, many people were unable to read. In England, public education wasn't required until the late 1800s. Because of this, in the early 1800s, about half of the population couldn't read books. In America, literacy rates varied by region and by gender. During about the same time, in the early 1800s, 80% of men and 50% of women in New England could read, but the numbers were significantly lower in the South. So public reading solved two problems. It allowed many people to enjoy a single book at the same time, and it also allowed those who couldn't read to enjoy the story as well. As print became mechanized and as education expanded, literacy rates would rise into the later 1800s. But as fiction moved robustly toward becoming a popular art form, Americans had really no fiction traditions of meaning to guide these new authors. These authors who wanted to experiment with fiction were largely free to find their own influences and experiment as they chose. Many of these writers looked to the traditions of poetry and nonfiction as the starting point for their experiments in fiction, traditions that were then grounded in the movement of Romanticism. And so in this lecture and the next, we're going to cover a lot of ground. These are the only two back-to-back lectures for the entire term where we'll cover many decades at once. And here is the reason why. The aesthetics of Romanticism were, in part, a reaction to a previous movement called the Enlightenment. So, 1. We need to understand the basics of the Enlightenment so that in the next lecture, 2. We can see how Romanticism is a reaction against the Enlightenment, particularly in nonfiction and poetry, so that then, 3. We can understand how new fiction writers were using the materials of Romanticism in poetry and nonfiction as an inspiration for early examples of American fiction. Hopefully that all makes sense. If so, here we go. The Enlightenment is often referred to as the Age of Reason. In America, it exists between 1725 and 1789. For centuries, people believed that a person was born into a life that they would lead as an adult. If your parents were merchants, you'd be a merchant most likely. If your parents were farmers, you'd most likely be the same, or at least find a job in the same economic strata of society. In early American life, many people looked to religion as a means of understanding themselves and their place in the world. But the Enlightenment presented a system that decreased the value of religion and increased the value of education. That is, children, by an act of heredity, weren't simply born into the types of lives they would occupy as adults. They could improve their situation through education and hard work. Likewise, they could also damage their future prospects through a lack of education and a lack of hard work. The Enlightenment viewed individual people as the masters of their own destiny and believed that through logic, discussion, and planning, together they could improve the society in which they lived. Before I go any further, I want to talk a little about the dates I'm using for our class. Not all scholars agree as to the start date and end date for the aesthetic periods we'll discuss in our class. Some scholars have proposed a later start date for the Enlightenment in America. Some have proposed an earlier one. And you may have a teacher in history that presents 1715 as the start date for this period, or even 1750. Unlike a baseball game or a fireworks show, aesthetic periods don't have a pre-configured start or end date. Scholars, after the fact, look at the material being produced and then, with consideration, present an argument that at or around this time, such as 1725, it seems that most of the intellectual work in America had shifted from a Puritan aesthetic and was then more influenced by the values of the Enlightenment. In this scheme, you can see that there is some room for different opinions, though those opinions all coalesce around some key dates. For example, the revolutionary documents and the Declaration of Independence are always keyed inside of the Enlightenment. How early these trends start and how long they last are up for debate. But in our class, the dates I'll use are 1725 to 1789. The Enlightenment as a system of thought valued logic and the scientific method. At the same time, it devalued writings based on emotion, imagination, and fantasy. It also devalued received books of religious instruction, such as the Bible, believing that people examining the world directly were in a better position to move society forward. During this period, many writers and philosophers directed their attention to the physical world around them, believing the primary way to understand an event or object was through reason, direct experience, and empirical tests. If you think of the body as a set of interconnected systems, Enlightenment writers believed that the mind, or maybe what we think of now as the brain, was the center of human experience, more so than sensual feeling or spiritual understanding or emotional experiences. René Descartes' assertion of being, "I think, therefore I am," might be identified as one of the key concepts that later Enlightenment writers would use to identify their understanding of humanity, namely, that thinking was central to the value of being human. In America, the Enlightenment contained a number of key ideas. I'm going to list 5 key ideas and terms and then talk about what they mean. 1. Deism. Deism is a religion based on the observation that the world was created not on a received religious text such as the Old and New Testaments. To understand the creator of the world, you don't look at a book, you look at nature to see the creator through the creation. 2. Liberalism. Liberalism is the notion that humans have natural rights and that government authority is not absolute, but based on the will of the consent of the governed. It favors the will of the people as a group or a whole over the will of the individual. 3. Scientific progress. The Enlightenment's enthusiasm for scientific discovery was directly related to the growth of deism and skepticism about received religious doctrines. Deists, at times, felt they had a religious duty to explore and understand God's laws as exhibited in nature and as defined through science. They argued that systematic, methodological observation of the natural world was central to understanding our place in it. The concept of empiricism is the belief that true knowledge comes from direct observation and study of the world around us. 4. The definition of man. Through these developments, man was increasingly seen as a biological being with an increased importance placed on his body and mind and a decreased importance placed on his spirituality. Scientists studied the human body, elements of health and disease, to better understand what conditions, such as surgery or medicine, improved the body and what conditions caused it damage. 5. Progressivism and the planned society. Progressivism is the belief that through observation, argumentation, and reason, mankind can make straightforward linear improvements to society. For example, from the laws of physics and astronomy, science moved to develop the laws of chemical reactions and the germ theory of disease to improve living conditions in densely populated cities. They analyzed the natural world in order to uncover the laws that govern the universe. Some scientists during this period were openly hostile to the Church's authority. Generally, they believed that the scientific method in which ideas were tested to prove whether or not they were true was a stronger path to guide society than religious dogma. Once the laws of nature had been established or perhaps discovered, humans would then be able to better structure a society that was in harmony with these laws. So where in America do we see lasting evidence of the Enlightenment? The Enlightenment often focuses its powers on groups of people and common areas between individuals. Medicine and the study of the human body examines ways in which human beings and their bodies are alike. Likewise in America, the structure of its growing cities were arranged to benefit the common man with work, financial opportunities, and educational training. That is, Enlightenment thought was often applied to large groups at the center of society. What type of fiction was produced in America during the Enlightenment? Well, there wasn't much at all, aside from a few very early examples, material that wasn't widely read. There was poetry, which was very popular. There was nonfiction, which was popular as well. But no writers in America were able to support themselves by writing during this period, in part because there was no way to mass produce their work. So where do we look for examples of Enlightenment writing? Well, political writing, such as argumentative tracts, like Common Sense and government documents, are strong examples of the period. Enlightenment thought, with its values of rationality and its belief in human-centered liberalism, directed a great deal of political thought in America in the late 1700s. The documents that created our nation are heavily influenced by the ideals of the Enlightenment. Let me read you a little bit from the Declaration of Independence. I'm sure you've heard this before, and if you haven't for some reason, it's also included in our online shell. But as I read a little bit from it this time, I'm going to point out where I see elements of Enlightenment thought being expressed in the document. Here we go. When, in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. Let me pause there for a second. This is not the God of the Old and New Testament. This is the God of nature, nature's God. This is the God that is discovered by looking at the natural world and then considering who or what might have made this. Of nature's God entitle them. A decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. And this is the concept of argumentation. When you are going to do something in a well-considered, well-planned way, you should put forth your reasonings so that others can examine your rationale. And so the Declaration of Independence is an argument in which evidence is given that's going to support the claim that now we need to separate ourselves from England. I'll continue. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Let me pause there for a second. These are the ideas of human-based liberalism. This is the concept that people, simply by existing, have certain moral rights. I'll continue. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. And here is that other concept of liberalism, that governments serve the people and not the other way around. And so aside from government documents, where else can you find examples of the Enlightenment in writing? You can find elements of the Enlightenment in nonfiction, such as in Benjamin Franklin's autobiography. Franklin's autobiography, divided into 4 sections, arranges advice and personal experiences into types of secular sermons. That is, at times he takes ideas and experiences from his past and puts them forward as models that others might follow. The most famous section of the autobiography are the 13 virtues. In the second part of his autobiography, he explains how he developed a system of virtues that he wished to govern his life. After developing the list, he created a double-column notebook in which he lists his offenses against each virtue on a daily basis. He was not able to perfect the virtues within himself, but ultimately he believed himself to be a better person by attempting to do so. The story and the list presumably are offered to readers as a way of encouraging them to follow his example of personal improvement. Here's the list. There were 13 initial virtues, but after the first edition, the list was redacted to just 12, as one of these virtues didn't sit so well with some readers. I won't read the full description for each item, but I'll read part of them to give you a sense of how the work was presented. Here it is. Temperance. Eat not to dullness, drink not to elevation. Silence. Speak not, but what may benefit others or yourself. Avoid trifling conversation. Order. Let all your things have their places. Let each part of your business have its time. Resolution. Then frugality, industry, sincerity, justice, moderation. Avoid extremes, forbear resenting injuries so much as you think they deserve. Cleanliness, tranquility, chastity. This is the virtue that gets removed. Chastity. Rarely use venery, and this is just an antiquated term that means sexual activity. Rarely use venery, but for health or offspring, never to dullness, weakness, or the injury of your own or another's peace or reputation. Well, Franklin here is being honest. As a young man, he had experienced many sexual encounters with women. At one point, he said that he was lucky not to have caught some terrible disease. And so he lists this as a virtue, his own understanding of sexual experience. This doesn't prove popular with some readers and is removed from the second edition. The last item on the list, humility. Imitate Jesus and Socrates. And here, Franklin is equating a person of antiquity, a philosopher, with a person of religious importance, as though the two in his mind are equal. As noted at the beginning of this short lecture, we aren't yet at the point where fiction, with the aid of the steam-powered press, is able to emerge as a popular literary form. The Enlightenment will have very little influence over the origins of fiction, but toward the end of the 1700s in Europe and America, an artistic movement was building in opposition to the Enlightenment, a group of poets and artists who rejected the idea that the center of humanity should be focused on rationality, and that humans themselves should be viewed primarily as centers of thought. Their ideas provoked a revolution in terms of how art should represent human experience and what specifically constituted artistic values. These artists and writers would later come to be known as the Romantics, and as the advancements in technology would dictate, would also be the group of writers who ushered in fiction as a popular artistic form. Their story and ideas are presented in the next lecture.